Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Now, depending on how you read it, the Bible seems to indicate that it's wrong to want things. But is it always wrong? And at what point do your personal desires actually become a violation of God's law? That's today on Authentic.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
You know, some days I really find myself with a little bit of a conflict on my hands. On the one hand, as a child of the Cold War, I'm a big fan of the freedom we enjoy in most Western societies. But then on the other hand, I cringe when I see just how materialistic we've gotten. And if I'm really honest, I'd have to admit, well, I'm doing it too. Last time we met, when we talked about the 8th commandment, the one that prohibits stealing, we kind of did this deep dive into the now prevalent notion that people exist for the sake of the state, and that you and I are just cogs in a machine, means to an end. That idea has been around since the days of ancient pharaohs and emperors, people who were often deified because they were thought to actually embody the state. And you find this idea that the state owns you in the writings of ancient Greek philosophers as well, people like Plato, who tried to paint a picture of the ideal human society in his now famous Republic. But you know, it was really Jean-Jacques Rousseau who kind of entrenched the idea that the state somehow owns you during the Enlightenment period. And when we looked at him the first time, you might remember that I mentioned, well, I'm a big fan of free market economies. Why? Well, it's not because I think they're perfect or that they don't have some serious shortcomings. And I really don't believe that free markets can give us a utopia. I mean, human attempts at creating some kind of paradise almost always end in complete disaster or even death because they're built on the idea that human beings would suddenly become entirely good and righteous if you could just place them in the right environment. It's a way of thinking about the world that ignores the problem in our human makeup, a flaw that the Bible describes as sin. So why would I lean toward free market economies? Well, it's not because they have the potential to eliminate all human suffering. It's because it's a system that's just a little more honest about our sinful human nature. You and I are unavoidably self-interested. When Western civilization moved away from the feudal system and from monarchy, and we started to build self-governed republics instead, what we were really doing was putting up fences around our tendency to serve self first. In theory, a free market economy is a system that sets you free to spend your life the way that you want, as long as your choices don't interfere with someone else's right to do exactly the same thing. Now, I should probably explain this just a little more carefully because so many people have this unfortunate tendency to see everything in black and white. And if somebody doesn't agree with us completely on every last point, then we start to think that they must be evil. So I know there will be some people who say, well, Shawn, if you favor that kind of freedom, that means you think greed is good. And of course, I don't. I think greed is a terrible way to live, and I completely agree with Jesus' warning about the materialistic worldview. Take care, he said, and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. You know, to be perfectly honest, I'm really kind of disturbed by the way that so much of Western Christianity has adopted a prosperity gospel. This idea that if you really, really love God, you're always going to be successful and rich. And I hate that because, well, it's a perversion of the Christian gospel. But all that aside, I still value what we have here in the West because so far, historically speaking, this is the very best we've been able to do. And it is a system that has lifted more people out of poverty than anything else we've ever tried. I mean, if you and I were living 400 years ago, I'd probably be living in a hut on a rich man's property somewhere in Western Europe, and there'd be no chance I'd have access to an education because, well, that wouldn't be my assigned station in life. I'd just be a serf. Market economies just seem to be a more honest way for us to deal with the problems that come from being sinful. It's a system that admits we're essentially selfish, and it tries to mitigate the damage we're allowed to cause. And again, that doesn't mean the system isn't problematic, because it really is. A lot of bad things happen when the almighty dollar becomes the god of your society. But when you consider the alternative, where the state becomes your god and you are a slave to that state, well, that's even worse. And I know there are people who will say that working for a wage is a form of oppression, but there is a big difference. I mean, you can always quit your job. It might lead to hardship and it might not be practical, but you still can choose to do it, as opposed to the people who suffered in the Russian gulags for having the wrong opinion. And it's on this point that I find myself at least a little bit conflicted. I do value the system I live in because it leaves me with a modicum of intellectual and religious liberty. And right now, I see concerning trends that are clearly moving in the wrong direction. But for the moment, you and I still have a great deal of freedom. So that's the upside. But then at the same time, I've got to admit that it's a system that can promote an ungodly attitude that's radically at odds with the principles found in the 10th commandment. And just in case you're a little bit rusty on what the 10th commandment actually says, let's just read it. It says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." So let's think this through. On the one hand, it's perfectly fine to want a better life, and it's fine to try to provide something better for your family. In fact, Paul even tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 5, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So that tells me there's nothing wrong with wanting things like a comfortable home or decent food or good clothing. Those are good things. And you'll notice that back in the 4th commandment, 6 of the 7 days each week are actually dedicated to working so that you can get those kinds of things for you and your family. But at the same time, God draws a definite line in the sand and says, if you cross this line, your natural desire to want things becomes a sin. That I would call the envy line. And you cross it when you go past the things you should want to the things that you shouldn't want, or to things that don't really and cannot really belong to you. If you think about it, the 10th commandment is kind of a kissing cousin to the 8th commandment, because coveting stuff that doesn't belong to you and shouldn't belong to you is the first step toward taking it. You're mentally setting the table to become a thief. And I think that's one of the key problems we've developed in our present economic environment. A lot of it is based on generating dissatisfaction. Advertisers sell things by generating a desire to buy them. And to a certain extent, there's really nothing wrong with that. I mean, people need refrigerators, and if you're in the refrigerator business, you're going to expend effort convincing people to buy your product. That makes sense. But then in a lot of ways, because we're sinful, we're going way past basic salesmanship into generating desires that might not be appropriate. Of course, there's nothing wrong if you can afford it with getting something a little bit nicer. But when we create desire among people who can't afford what we're selling to the point where they're willing to accumulate debt just to own that thing, well, that becomes a problem. Haven't you noticed that all your neighbors have a bass boat? Don't you think you deserve a bass boat? Well, maybe not. Not if I'm struggling to feed my kids. I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
It's pretty hard to escape a culture of perpetual dissatisfaction, which is kind of what we've got here in the Western world. Now again, I'm not saying I want a different system, because I really don't. I'd rather be free than go back to having the state micromanage everybody. And of course, that means that if there's a problem with coveting, the problem really lies with me. And that would be true for any of the 10 commandments, because if you have to force somebody to keep those commandments against their will, Well, they're not really keeping them. You can only keep them by choice, or they don't really have a whole lot of moral value. I think Jesus actually demonstrated this with the way he broadened our understanding of God's moral law. Let's say that everybody in society finally gets sick and tired of adultery. They hate the way that it damages families and violates trust. So we pass some really harsh laws to make it stop. And because this is just a thought experiment, let's make the penalty really bad. Let's make the penalty for adultery really serious. You get the death penalty for cheating on your spouse. And to make it even less tempting to break the commandment, let's say it's not even a neat and tidy execution. It's old school, in the town square on the first Wednesday of every month, and it's going to be really hard to watch. It'll be a public stoning or burning at the stake or something really, really awful. And to make sure we catch the people committing adultery, there's $1 million cash reward for telling on your neighbors. Now, under those kinds of circumstances, the number of people committing adultery would suddenly plummet. But did it solve the basic problem? The answer is, well, no, not if you consider the way Jesus explains it in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard, Jesus said, that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So banning the practice of adultery doesn't really solve the problem, because at the core of the matter is your sinful human heart. It's really an issue of intent. Keeping God's commandments begins here in the heart. And of course, so would breaking them. You might be able to stop people from acting out their desires, but it's impossible to keep people from thinking about them. It's one thing to keep yourself from committing a sin, but it's really quite another thing to grow to hate that sin. And so, as much as some people might think it's a good idea, forcing obedience to God's law doesn't really solve the problem, any more than adjusting society can fix it. Tinkering with the state is not going to correct what's ultimately wrong with human beings. Whether you hope to change the state because you want some kind of a theocracy or just because you want a big, powerful, secular state. You cannot change sinful hearts just by changing the laws of the land. The solution has to start with you. We're not living in the perfect kingdom of Christ. Not yet. And you and I have to try and navigate this broken planet in a way that puts a smile on God's face. As Jesus prayed, "I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one." I've got to tell you, it's a huge relief to know that Christ actually lived in this place. He understands what you're up against, and he actually experienced real temptation out in the desert. And by the end of that episode, Jesus tells us, "Look, I've got your back." It's a little bit like that popular religious commercial that says that Jesus, quote, "gets us." You don't have to be alone when it comes to the matter of keeping God's commandments. Remember what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He writes, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it." But how in the world does that work? How do you stop coveting? I struggle with this one as much as you do, and in some cases, maybe even more. I've been a Mopar guy as long as I can remember. And when I see somebody driving one of those brand new Challengers, there is a part of me that says, well, how is that fair? Why don't I have that? Or when I see somebody with a really nice sailboat and they've retired before the age of 60, man, I wish I could have that. I want that too. And again, at one level, there's really nothing wrong with wanting a good life. But the minute you cross the line into envy, when you find yourself resenting the people who have what you want, the minute you start to daydream about unethical shortcuts to get what you want out of this world, well, then you're moving into territory that God clearly forbids. Why? Because when you live in a broken world with a broken heart, there's never going to be an end to the stuff you want. You're never going to find happiness. Remember, Jesus taught us how to find real contentment. He said, "For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. but seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. In this case, Jesus is actually talking about necessities, things like food, clothing, and shelter. Even then, God says seek Him first. Find your identity in who He is and leave behind all that anxiety. Real happiness, real contentment is never found in possessions, and that becomes doubly true when we're talking about stuff you don't actually need. You know what it's like. You want something, you get it, and for about 4.5 days you experience a real sense of satisfaction. But then you start to notice what's wrong with that new possession. Or you notice that owning it hasn't actually changed who you are, and it hasn't helped you with your biggest character defects. That's because you were not originally wired to find satisfaction in stuff. Let me show you something that Paul wrote. And I'm guessing you've heard this before because right now, a lot of those prosperity preachers are openly abusing this text for personal gain. I mean, have you ever heard a preacher read this verse as a way to make you think that your number one goal in life should be getting rich? Paul writes, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Well, there you have it. Some preachers will tell you, if you want more money, you can do that through Christ who strengthens you. Want a new Corvette in your driveway? Just create a vision board, put it over your desk, and believe that you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. There's just one problem with that. That's not at all what Paul was teaching. I mean, just ask yourself, why don't these preachers ever read the whole thing? Here's what it actually says, starting in verse 12. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What's Paul talking about? Getting wealthy? No. God enables Paul to be content regardless of circumstance. In fact, Paul has learned how to be happy even when he's poor or sitting in jail. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Okay, maybe we should look at some of the practical things you can do to deal with the problem of coveting. The most essential problem you and I have is our fallen human nature, this tendency to put ourselves at the very center of the universe. If you constantly make life all about you, I promise that finding real contentment is pretty much going to be impossible because your ego is one of those things that you can feed and feed and feed, and it will never be full. So what would happen if you started thinking about yourself from a slightly different angle? What if instead of wanting to be the center of everything, you actually gave God that role? What if everything you are and everything you own actually belongs to Him? And what if instead of being a land baron or a wealthy owner, you thought of yourself more of a property manager, where your real job is to take care of somebody else's things? Now, if you're a property manager and you want to keep your job, you're going to have to do it in a way that keeps the boss happy. If a human employer put me in charge of an investment portfolio, what would happen if I dipped into his account to buy stuff for me? And let's say my boss is really generous too. I have a decent home, food to eat, and all my bills are getting paid. All of my basic costs and obligations are being covered. In that case, I am part of the boss's overhead. But outside of my salary, the rest of the money belongs to him. When you adopt the understanding that you're God's property manager, it gives you a much different perspective on who you are and what you're supposed to be doing with your life. For example, let's think about your house. I know you're the one paying the bills right now, but let's suppose you're really just the property manager and you're taking care of that home for its real owner. What difference would that make in the way you conduct yourself? What if the answer to a covetous heart is to assume that we don't really own anything? And I mean absolutely nothing. Most of you are aware that many Christians practice something called tithing, where we give 10% of our income to the church. Cynical people say that the church is scamming Christians, but that's because they don't really understand what tithing is. It's not a money grab. I mean, God hardly needs my money. It's a tangible way of acknowledging that I no longer own my own life. I've surrendered it completely to God. You might think of it like a franchise fee. God sets me up in life and He takes care of me. He handles all the big problems, and all He wants in return is 10% of the profit. Now, if you've never tried this, let me tell you, it really works. And you'll never understand that until you give it a try. I can tell you for sure that my wife and I are not wealthy people, not by any stretch of the imagination. But we've been tithing for our entire married life, and somehow we've never missed a house payment, we've never missed a meal, and we've never failed to provide for our kids because we're tithing. In fact, it's really just the opposite. Somehow, and honestly, it's hard to prove this empirically, but somehow we do better because of this. Somehow, 90% of your income in a relationship with God ends up being a whole lot more money than 100% without Him. And again, I know some people have grown to think of it as a big scam by organized religion. And after watching even a little bit of religious TV, I completely understand why some people would think that way. I mean, to be really blunt, I'm sick and tired of preachers who say stuff like, send me a faith gift, a seed, and I guarantee that your seed will grow into 100 times as much. They're essentially promising that if you make them rich, God will make you rich, and frankly, you're not going to find that in the Bible. So honestly, I really do understand the skepticism. But I can also tell you firsthand that tithing works. It's not because God needs my money. He really, really doesn't. Tithing teaches me that I don't own anything. And again, when I leave 10% of my income with God, it reminds me that He and I are partners in my life. God pays for everything because He owns everything. He sets me up with a job and a house and groceries and clothes to wear, and all He wants is 10%. Honestly, I think I'd be crazy not to take a deal like that. I mean, imagine that you're going into business and you're going to open a widget factory, but you're penniless. You have no capital. So along comes an angel investor who says, look, I'll build the factory and I'll buy the office equipment and I'll give you a company car. And all I want in return, 10%. My first reaction would be, don't you mean 90%? Because after all, you're the one absorbing all of the risk. So maybe try thinking about your life from that perspective. I can assure you, if you assume that you're managing somebody else's stuff, you're not going to buy things you don't need. And you're going to be careful with what you do have. If the boss gives you a car, all you really need is something reliable and cost-effective. In that case, I don't need a Lambo. When you become a steward or a property manager, you don't find fulfillment in luxury. You find fulfillment in responding to the trust that investor's placed in you. So now let's take that thought experiment back to the real world. God is my angel investor, and I've come to the realization that we're in this together. I'm finding genuine fulfillment in the only place anybody can actually find it, in a meaningful relationship with the God who made us. I'll be right back after this.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Just before the break, I was talking about tithing and the way it can serve as a bit of a remedy for the problem of greed. If I start to think of myself as the head butler or a steward in God's house, suddenly the need to accumulate more things kind of just evaporates. It doesn't seem important. I mean, here's this all-important, all-knowing being who trusts me with His stuff. And you know, I think that might actually be the root of the problem when it comes to the 10th commandment. You and I have broken trust with the God of the universe, the Creator. Back in Eden, we decided that we really can't trust Him. And once that all-important trust relationship was damaged, well, we tried to find meaning for ourselves our own way. Some people started chasing power. Other people chased things like fame or influence. And some people just started accumulating stuff, hoping that somehow all those possessions would raise their stock value and make their lives seem meaningful. But pay careful attention to the political climate that we're living in right now in this moment. There's this old school resentment of the rich and the powerful that seems to be growing by the day right now. Partly because politicians are feeding people's sense of envy to get them to vote for their party. And it's getting to the point where it's getting kind of worrisome because it's starting to look a little bit like the restlessness in the streets of Paris on the eve of the French Revolution. And we all know how that ended. Look, I understand. It's easy to hate the rich and the powerful. They're really kind of a natural scapegoat. But let's do another thought experiment. Put yourself in their shoes for just, say, 10 or 20 minutes. You can't really go out in public and enjoy yourself because somebody's going to take your picture and put it on social media. And trust me, it's not going to be flattering because they want to take you down a notch and put you in your place. You're going to have to live your life under a microscope. And there's always somebody out there waiting to take what you have. Famous actors might not have to worry about money, but they do have to worry that their fame won't last or that things like their good looks are going to start to fade. And when that happens, and it always does, half the world celebrates because they were quietly resenting you. Now, I'm not going to say that I've never fantasized about being fabulously wealthy because, well, who hasn't? But there's a whole new set of worries that comes with that life that I don't have to deal with right now. And I can promise you, those 1%ers, yeah, some of them are happy, but some of them really aren't. Things like money, fame, and power are not this silver bullet that produces long-term contentment. I mean, you might not think of yourself as wealthy, but compared to much of the world, you kind of are. And still, you find yourself unhappy. At the end of the day, we covet because we're dissatisfied. And we're dissatisfied because we're looking for happiness in all the wrong places. Possessions break. They wear out. Money comes and goes. Fame never, ever lasts. But a partnership with God? Tell me how that's going to leave you empty. It doesn't mean there'll be no more stress. It doesn't mean no more problems, because believe me, I know firsthand that's not actually true. But here's what I do find in the pages of this book. I find hope. And honestly, you don't have to covet hope, because God's got no limit on how much of that He's willing to give you. Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.